Hello and welcome to Module 5. We have two parts to this week's lecture. There's a lot of information to cover. We're going to be talking in this Part 1 lecture about standard specifications and the professional organizations that establish those two things. So, first of all, we're going to talk about standards. Standards, as opposed to specifications, are documented agreements that a printer or a designer or a print buyer or anyone else, paper manufacturer, ink manufacturer, can follow to ensure consistency and repeatability and reliability throughout processes and devices and substrates and materials and so on. Standards are universal. I should say that every industry has standards. Let me clarify that. So on the screen, there's going to be a lot of text throughout the slide. I'm not going to read it all to you, but if you feel the need, go ahead and pause that and read through these bullet points. But there's a lot of benefits to standards, and they're essential in industry, whether that's the print industry, the graphics industry, or TV, film, anything GIT related, or any other industry. You got to have some standards to ensure that you get predictable results on different systems and with different people and different processes. So we're going to go through a whole bunch of different standards organizations real quick and kind of talk about some of the differences in those. I'm sure that some of these terms you've heard of before, but as it says on the slide here, it's kind of an alphabet soup. So if you see these acronyms for these organizations, then that's an indicator that you probably might want to look into it and at least be familiar with what type of organization that is. So broken into some categories here, there's international organizations, and some of those organizations are accredited or consensus organizations, which means that the standards that they agree on and they set are done by consensus, or they're voluntary. So a group of businesses, printers, whatever organizations are interested in establishing and having a standard for a certain thing, they'll approach this organization, and that organization will put together a committee that will develop a standard or a subcommittee or whatever else. So some of those organizations are the ISO. ISO is probably a very familiar one to anybody that does photography. You may not realize it, but that setting on your camera, the ISO setting, stands for International Standards Organization, which is the governing body that determines what ISO, the sensitivity of the camera, what that actually means. So that on one camera model or another model or another manufacturer's camera, you get the same results. So International Electrotechnical Commission, that's the European version of the ISO, strictly European. American National Standards Institute, or ANSI, that's a standards organization similar to the ISO, but it's a national body. So as opposed to the ISO, it produces standards, first of all, for the United States, and then from there, sometimes we'll put forth those on upwards to the ISO. There's other international bodies that oversee standards, like the CIE, which is the color organization that we're concerned with. There's the WHO, which is Medical and World Health Organization. UNESCO has to do with World Heritage Sites and things like that. There's all sorts of organizations and bodies and commissions and associations and programs that determine standards for all kinds of different industries. There are also trade specifications. I probably should have updated the top of the slide there to not say standards, but specifications. Specifications are developed by different groups. So usually these are organizations that are developing for their own use, as opposed to a standard, which is the organization developing it for everyone in the world. Specifications are a little bit less widely used. They're specific to a type of field. So ICC, for example, the International Color Consortium, American Society for Testing of Materials, ASTM, for example. It's no longer called that. That's the old acronym. It's ASTM International now, because it's not just American, but they do materials testing. For example, if you were to look at their website right now, they're making their material testing standards available for free for the medical grade materials for personal protective equipment. Trade groups This is what we're going to talk about in depth a little bit more here, are things like SWAP, SNAP, and GRACOL. Those are specifications, not standards. Then there's private or de facto types of specifications like PostScript, PDF, TIFF. These are all things that need to work flawlessly in different environments and different use cases, different workflows and different production environments, but they wouldn't do so without there being a standard. And so these things exist as standards so that workflows can be unified. If we're to go even closer, let's look at, for example, one small aspect of the International Standards Organization, and it's composed of or comprised of lots of subcommittees. And one of those committees that's relevant to what we do is the Technical Committee 130, which is about graphic technology. Within that committee, which oversees graphic technology in general, there are subcommittees such as Working Group 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, that deal with different aspects of graphic technology. Prepress data exchange, for example, or process control and metrology, and so on. Working Group 3, that covers metrology as part of that technical committee, is responsible for developing many standards that are used, for all kinds of stuff related to color metrology and print production in general. If you haven't gathered so far, this lecture is really heavily focused on print. Commercial printing, high volume printing. You can read through some of these standards here. There's just a random selection of some of the standards that organization or that subcommittee has developed over time. And these standards get reevaluated periodically. They get updated, they get modified, they get deleted occasionally too and replaced. So you can search out these standards on the ISO website. You can search out the specific numbers and see what they include and what those standards are certifying or documenting and providing information about. Let me go back to the previous slide actually. This working group on metrology was somewhat connected to the ASU Polytechnic campus because some individuals who were on that working group took advantage of the fact that we had some empty rooms and that they were associated with our faculty at the time. And so the metrology lab, which is no longer the metrology lab on campus, is now the pre-media or pre-press room for the print and imaging lab. So the space where customer service and everybody works in the print lab, those of you that are familiar with on-campus facilities there, that used to be a color metrology lab where this working group met occasionally and helped to develop the standards that are used in industry. So as you can tell already, there's so many different organizations. All these organizations are made up of committees, and within those committees, there's subcommittees and subgroups. And at one point, the industry as a whole kind of decided that needed to be simplified a little bit. And so CGATS came along. This is the Committee for Graphic Arts Technology Standards. And their role was to consolidate all of these standards for printing and publishing into kind of an umbrella organization. So what they do is they identify areas where standards are needed, where they exist already, and they summarize that, and sometimes they'll produce standards or they'll recommend to other bodies to produce standards. So specifically to the graphic arts industry, that's what CGATS is for. And they're really responsible for a lot of beneficial information and organizing the industry at a point where it wasn't terribly organized. Specifications, getting into specifications, there's other specs that we want to be aware of, and these are more guidelines. These are established by trade associations. So, for example, SWAP, standard specifications for web offset publications. SWAP is a set of guidelines about how printing should be done on web offset presses. And that we'll talk about this in more depth. I have another slide. I don't want to get carried away right now. But another one you may have heard of before, or at least seen in Photoshop, is SNAP. So specifications for newspaper advertising production. GRACOL, general requirements for applications in commercial offset lithography. First, flexographic imagery production specifications and tolerances. It's a mouthful. There's so many acronyms when we're talking about these standards and specifications. So let's talk about SWAP. SWAP is kind of the one that started it all off in terms of these published specifications. And so at a time when magazine publication and high volume printing was really taken off, and the point where electronic systems were starting to come into the picture, and it wasn't just a mechanical process anymore, desktop publishing, scanning, even digital photography coming into it, you have a workflow with materials coming from all over the place. And the end result needs to be high quality. Catalogs, magazines, other things where it's really high volume that's going to be done on a web offset press. And everything needs to be prepared to be compatible with that workflow. And so this specification was achieved by consensus, where everybody on the committee had to agree that this is the best way to accomplish this task or this workflow or this process, or to define this term or establish the type of substrate and characteristics of material, whatever. So all of these specifications were combined to establish the SWAP standard. So that started off a whole lot of other specifications from that point, but really there wasn't a whole lot of organization and compatibility here to begin with before SWAP came along. Another aspect of SWAP is the press form. So the organization SWAP, it became organized a little more formally. They established a corporation, a SWAP corporation, and print these press sheets, which you can see in the image here. And these press sheets are composed of a bunch of test targets, color bars, color patches, reference images, color gradients, and so on. So you could visually evaluate your check. You could measure it with instrumentation as well. And so they would ship out these press forms all over the country to different printers, and then the printer could print the file, so they could actually produce this on their own equipment, and then they could match these. So the process of aligning a press to this test chart is going to allow the printer to say our device meets this SWAP standard. And from there, that SWAP standard can be used throughout the whole workflow. For example, when a designer or even a photographer needs to produce or prepare an image to be printed at that facility, they could proof and convert that image to SWAP before they send it over, and then send it over and know that the press meets that SWAP specification. And the images and the content going onto that press will be within the tolerances of that specification. GRACOL is another specification that's similar to SWAP. It's just more detailed, oriented towards the offset lithography process rather than web presses. So it's very detailed in how much it covers on the type of paper, the type of inks, ink densities, line screens, and everything that is involved with offset lithography. And the end result, because of the type of papers that can be run on an offset litho press as opposed to a web offset press, there's higher standards of quality, and you can achieve higher results. So again, depending on the type of the press that you're doing, if that press meets GRACOL, then you want to prepare your content to be printed according to those GRACOL standards. Snap, more of the same. This is for newspapers, and the test chart that you see over down the right is something that a newspaper printer could print themselves. They send that in to the SNAP organization, and the SNAP organization is then going to measure that and offer or issue a certificate stating that they have achieved a certain score on that test chart. Throughout the different types of print technology, whether we're talking about Gravure or Flexo or whatever we're talking about, there are different associations that do the same thing too. In Gravure, it's GAA, the Gravure Association of America, and it goes back quite a ways as well.